Hi, I'm Phil Lowe at the Furniture Institute of Massachusetts, and this is The Art of Woodworking. In this session, what I'd like to do is to show you how to do some chip carving. And if you recall from one of the first episodes, that's a motif like on this little box where you find, the geometric forms and we make stab cuts and make little chips, and you end up with a decoration like this. So let's get started. The next thing I'd like to do is to show you a little bit about chip carving. So on the opposite side of this board, if you'll take a look at this, we got some decoration that's going on. It's very similar to that little box that I showed you a little bit earlier. Now this is what they call a sawtooth, which is the one of the simpler ones to do, and we'll start off doing the sawtooth. Now the sawtooth requires a different tool. It requires a straight chisel that's wider than the actual cut that you need to make, and we need to go ahead and do a layout first. So, okay, I held this to the board with a couple of sheetrock screws. So you could use, I use double stick tape once in a while, and you certainly don't want to screw it on if you're actually going to use this surface or it's going to be visible. So, but since this is just an exercise, I'm just going to go ahead and screw this down. And basswood is so soft it doesn't take much with just a regular screwdriver to set this in. If it was a harder wood, you'd probably need to drill some holes, pilot holes, so that you don't break the screw off. All right, so we got a clean surface now, and we're going to come in 3/8 of an inch or so, or 3/4 of an inch. And we'll put a parallel line to the edge, and then we'll come in 1.5 inches or 1 1/4 inches, which makes this a 1/2 inch. How about it? What is that? Yeah, it's about a 1/2 inch. Okay, and we'll run another line. And this is a fairly simple layout. Basically, if we take a square, this is a 45-degree angle, and if we work off of the end here, and wherever these intersect with the parallel lines, we just need to draw lines all the way along. Now I'm going to lay these out. So these are all great exercises to learn how to do. And this is all about controlling the chisel and getting the proper depth of cut. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to do 2 or 3 of these along here. So they're very similar layouts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first of all just do this sawtooth cut on 2 or 3 of these. And the way that we handle that is we take a straight chisel, and if we hold this on the line like so. Now, one of the things I have to be conscious of is that this bevel that I have here has to be perpendicular or straight up and down. If I put the tool straight up and down, it's actually making a V cut like this into the surface of the board, and I don't really want that to happen. I want that wall to be straight up and down. So if I come back this way, and the other thing that I have to do is I have to have it on the line, and I have to tilt the chisel. Now, if I look at the space between the edge of the chisel and the surface of the board, that's how deep I'll make my cut, because I want the cut to go from the deepest point to the shallowest point where it is making no cut at the where the two lines intersect. So I'm going to go ahead and make that cut first. And usually if you're doing this type of work, you want to do the same cut over and over again. So I'll come back in the opposite direction and make that cut. And you have to be fanatical about putting it on right on the line. And now we're going to come back with 3 cuts. This one needs to be a little bit deeper. I'm going to come back in this direction, and I'm going to make 1 cut, 2 cuts, 3 cuts, maybe 4. The 4th one's right up to your line. Now what we're trying to do here is to try to get a nice consistent depth of cut and have that plane go all the way across. And again, we're going to make 1, 2, maybe 3 cuts. Make sure the corners cleaned out well and you got a nice flat surface. So this is what we call chip carving. And as you can see, we're taking 1 chip, 2 chips, and then 3 chips. And make sure that the corner is cleaned out. So, you know, if you just continuously go across like that, you'll end up with the same pattern like you see here, going all the way across. Now, if we go ahead and alter these slightly with vertical lines at every other point of intersection, we're going to make these a little different now. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have these vertical lines deep, and then the opposite deep, and then the opposite deep, and the opposite deep, and the opposite deep. Now we got to come back, and we're going to make cuts in this direction where it's the deepest along this line. We're going to make every other cut deep, like so. And then we're going to come back in the opposite direction and make every other cut deep. And then we have to do the same on the opposite side. And the same over here. Okay, now we're going to go back this way. We're going to make cuts coming in this direction. And we want to finish up right along that line. We'll do the next one. If the shaving doesn't come off, come back and cut it off. Okay, then we're going to come back in the opposite direction. And along there, those should meet up. And we want to make sure that that falls away. You can also come in from this direction as well. You're cutting across the grain. So it's a matter of whether or not it gives you a smooth enough surface. And the trick is to make this center cut come down and meet up perfectly. So we'll do the opposite side now. Couple of cuts. Now, depending on how deep you make these cuts will depend on the shadowing. If you get too deep, sometimes it's a little difficult to get the tool inside there, because if you look at the tool, when we angle it ever so slightly, this is no longer perpendicular, so the cut coming in is slightly angled. So you have to be able to, contend with that. Make sure that the shavings are falling away. And then we come back in from the opposite direction. And one of the tricks is controlling the cut as well. So when I'm grabbing a hold of the tool this way, I'm actually pushing with my right hand and I'm restricting the cut with my left hand. So I'm not just careening through, which would spoil my work. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now let's go on to this one over here. Now this one is done by just adding, let me think here. I think if we bring a line off of here with each one of these, the center point, and then we come back off of that with lines, 45-degree lines as well. So you notice that you can create numerous patterns with just this 45-degree cut. Okay, now we have to do two levels here. We have to do a level at this corner here, and then a double triangle out towards the end. So we'll go ahead and do the inside first with our stab cuts. You got to be crazy about making sure that your tool is lined up with the line this way, and you got the same angle each time. So you notice how I grab this, I sort of restrict myself from going too deep. And we also have to come back and make cuts on this opposite side as well. Now I'm going to take these two outside triangles off first, this way. You notice, oh, I missed that cut. Easy to do. And then come back. Okay, now we need to go ahead and take out this back corner here, which is a little bit more difficult. We have to make sure that we get an angle going all the way across. And it's all about creating the shadows for those lines now. So that's three different, pieces of chip carving, and they all look quite different depending on how you look at them. Now there's this one last one here, which is actually squares that go all the way across. We'll try that one. Well, it's very similar. Basically, you just have to make X's. So I'll just show you the layout, and basically the procedure is the same, because I'd like to get along and show you a little bit more about some curved work as well. Okay, so if I start off here like so, I basically have to do this and then start off with just these to begin with. I'll just do a few of these. And so each one of these now have to have lines coming across this way. And we're going to go in the opposite direction now, which is like so. These are going to be angled cuts. So we're making these X's through here. And come back in the opposite direction. So okay, so these are what we're trying to save. A smaller tool might be a little more of use here. Try this one. So we're going to make these cuts like so. And go back this way. And back in this direction. And then we need to chip out these triangles here. And you can certainly see how that's starting to form now. So that's a pretty good start for some chip carving. I think if you look online, you'll find a lot more about doing some curves and so forth, but you can certainly see you can develop some simple patterns with just a couple of simple tools. Okay, the next thing I'd like to do is just show you, how we carve on curved surfaces like this. So this is what we call carving the donut. And the donut, when you learn how to do this, it really is eye-opening as far as grain direction is involved. So when we think about this now, if we see that the grain is running from myself to the other side, I'm going to put a center line in this way, and a center line going across this way. So basically you've got 4 quadrants. And I'm going to carve the outside of this now. I'm going to round it off using a gouge just to soften the surface. But the thing is that you're going to find is that if I carve, this quadrant here, if the box of straws is actually running through the piece in this direction. So if I have the box of straws here, if I carve in this direction, I'm going to be laying those straws down. So this outside is going to be I need to carve in that direction. On this quadrant over here, this gets flipped over like so. So I'm going to be carving in this direction. So this is the direction of cut there. And then what happens here is if I flip it over in this direction, you know, the direction of cut is in this direction. So I'm going to be carving in that direction. And then if this gets flipped in this direction, if I carve back in this direction here, I'm going to be going with the grain on in each one of those quadrants. Now I'll just grab a, let's see, let's try a number 520 here or something like that. So I can confidently, you know, take a cut. You know, let's say if we want to carve this around all the way to about there and down to about here. What I'm going to do is I can start here and make these cuts coming around like this. You notice that those are cutting nice and smoothly right to about the center line there. And I can go a little further back here because we got straight grained. And if I go here, you notice it's cutting beautifully right around. So here I'm taking advantage of the grain. Now if I go too far back in this direction, what you're going to see happen is it's going to chip out like that. And you know, that's what we're trying to avoid here. So you have to find that sweet spot where you can, you know, come back in the opposite direction in order to be going with the grain at all times. And what you see here is it's split right along there, so it's really right about at that center line where the grain changes. So if I come back in this direction, I'll be cutting with the grain, and then in the opposite direction, cutting with the grain. Okay. Now, one of the things that happens if I want to carve the inside of this, this donut, what happens is the grain direction changes completely in the opposite direction. So, in other words, this quadrant here now, if I look at the fibers coming out like so, I need to be carving in this direction. So the carving direction is here, which is completely opposite of what we had on the outside, which was going in the opposite direction. And this one flips over, and we're carving in this direction. And then simultaneously like so. So instead of starting at the corners here and coming around to the very ends, we're going to be starting, you know, in the at the ends and coming around to the center. So this is going to flip around like so, and we're going to carve in this direction. So the arrows, you know, tell the story here. Now, in order to reach inside of here, I'm going to introduce that second tool, which is the back bend, which will allow me to make my cuts easily because the handle is going to be up out of the way. Whereas if I try to use something like this, what happens is the blade will hit the material and start to bounce on me, and it'll leave a surface that's irregular. So when I go to start my cut here, what I'm going to do is come around in this direction and around in this direction. And again, it's trying to make those cuts match up. And around in this direction. And around in this direction. So if I was to carve this entire donut, on both sides, top side and underside, I would have to carve in 16 different directions. 4 going around the outside in this direction, 4 around the inside of here, 4 more on the opposite side on the outside, and 4 more on the inside. So 16 different directions in order to carve, this one circle. So this is a really important lesson, and if you're going to do any carving in the round, this is one of the lessons that you really have to think about, because when we start to carve on curves, this is where, the rubber meets the road, let's put it that way. So for now, I'm Phil Lowe at the Furniture Institute of Massachusetts, and this is the Art of Woodworking.